Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest research news. At the height of the lockdown period, over half of the world's population reduced their mobility by more than 50%. What impact will this have on the planet, and what should the recovery phase look like? Today, we are joined by two guests to discuss the impact of the lockdown period on greenhouse gas emissions and air pollutants, as well as to discuss what a green recovery should look like if the objective is to limit greenhouse gas emissions and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. JD Farrugia is the co-founder of the Climate Herald, a new online publication dedicated to communicating the science behind the climate crisis with a focus on Central and Southeastern Europe. JD, thank you very much for joining us. And Simona Getova is also a co-founder of the Climate Herald. She has been involved in environmental and climate justice campaigning, community organizing, and political education since 2012. For the past 4 years, she has been providing consultancy in the field of integrated climate and energy policymaking. She's a doctoral researcher with the Political and Social Science program in the Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. Simona, thank you very much for joining us as well. So JD, I would like to first start with you. You have recently written an article for the Climate Herald where in large part you discuss a new study that was published which looks at the impact of the lockdown period on greenhouse gas emissions and air pollutants. Can you tell us a little bit what this study found?
Yes. So there has been a lot of talk, I think, since the lockdown period and the pandemic has started about the fact that there's been a decrease in human activity in various sectors and what effect this could potentially have on the environment and also with regards to the climate crisis that we're currently facing. And I found this study that was published on Nature, and using data, they found that there was a reduction in the emissions of certain greenhouse gases, such as nitrogen oxide, by about 30% in April, 20% reduction in sulfur dioxide emissions throughout this period as well. So there has actually been data, or at least that they have found data to show that there have been a decrease in certain greenhouse gas emissions and their pollutants because of this time. Obviously, then what was interesting was what they found in terms of what the long-term effects will be of this decrease.
So what is that? What do they think the short to medium and long-term effect of this decrease will be?
So short-term effects, there might be some. However, they also did find that the decrease in emissions of, for example, nitrogen oxide and the decrease in emissions of sulfur dioxide actually kind of cancel each other out anyway. So even short-term effects might not be that significant, but on the longer term, especially post 2030, we're not really seeing a very significant reduction in warming. We're talking about negligible, in fact, was the word they used, negligible cooling, anywhere between 0.01 to 0.005 degrees Celsius by 2030, which obviously leads one to believe that what is needed to actually stay within, for example, 1.5 degrees Celsius post-industrial is much bigger and much more longer term as well.
So they really found that these emissions will not have an impact in the medium term even. And so can you tell us a little bit about how they calculated the changes, the differences, the changes in greenhouse gas emissions during the lockdown period, how much they reduced?
Yeah, so according to the study, they got the data from Apple and Google mobility data. And from there, they calculated based mainly on people's reduction in mobility, which, as you said earlier, according to a study of about 114 countries, people reduced their mobility by, I think, a bit more than 50%. So it was based on this data.
Yeah, I think I saw in the study that for all the countries it was above 50%, and for 114 of them, I think it said near 80% reduction in mobility. So, and that's quite a lot.
Yeah.
So given that the researchers didn't found that this reduction won't really have much of an impact, what do they recommend for the so-called recovery phase and going forward?
I think it was this part of the study which really interested us and which really tied into the article that we wrote, which is in fact just this the recovery. How do we respond to this? And they mentioned that on the one hand, you've got the scenario where we see this as a 2-year blip in economic activity and mobility and whatnot, and then going back to business as usual right after, potentially through bailouts of some of the dirtier industries or whatnot. And if this happens, then we're definitely on course for exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius post-industrial temperatures, which would be, no short of catastrophic for the world. However, they mentioned a green stimulus, a potential green recovery post the pandemic, which they characterized as potentially about 1.2% of GDP injection, and obviously the right sort of climate policy measures. I would imagine decarbonization, and this would ensure that this would definitely lead to us keeping below 1.5 degrees, and also seeing a cooling or a reduction rather of about 0.3 degrees Celsius by 2050. Because I don't think I mentioned this, it's actually only after 2030, which is where we will start to see the changes of our actions essentially now and our response to the pandemic.
So now that this study has established that the lockdown period will do little to impact the cooling of the planet in the medium, even in the short term, I would like to make this conversation a bit more concrete now. So Simona, you're involved on the ground with a lot of work that is related to what the researchers here are recommending. So can you tell us a little bit about your work?
Yes, thank you, Cam, for having me. And thank you for this important discussion that you're leading. Surely we cannot just look at that green stimulus that is being put forward by several, especially developed nations, and expect that this will solve our problems. We are aware that people are suffering now, and people have been suffering, and we know for a fact that it's the poorest and most marginalized that are bearing the brunt from the climate crisis as well, and especially in this these interlinked social, economic, and climate crisis is what impacts these people even more. So what is I come from Macedonia, and what we have started there is a Coalition of the Future, which is a coalition by individuals, groups, initiatives, academics and scholars, educators, and medical workers, and it's people who even some policymakers are involved in the process. But it's people who come together to break the silos that we are kind of told to work in this neoliberal system, and create a common front for collective action that is on a national level, but also on a Balkan level, on the regional level. We're currently in the process of creating the Balkan Green and Just Recovery Plan, as well as a Balkan Green Deal. What I can say is that we just take this narrative of a Green Deal and a green and just recovery as a framework where we can do collective visioning that centers the voices of the people on the ground, and finds ways to put an end to social and economic inequality while respecting the limits of the planet, while protecting land, water, and air, while upholding human rights and supporting people in the process.
So you mentioned that this coalition is also trying to bring different stakeholders together so they don't work in silos. Can you just unpack a little bit what you meant by that?
Yes. So, for instance, in terms of the Balkan Green Deal, the Balkan Coalition for a Balkan Green Deal and Balkan Green and Just Recovery, we have policymakers on board. There are academics and scholars that are on board who work in their respective countries on, for example, the GHG, the greenhouse emissions inventories of the countries from the region. We have educators who work with young children, but also who are researchers. So, like from very young students to much further on into the higher education. And especially people and activists on the ground who work within communities, with feminist groups, with LGBTQI, advancing LGBTQI plus rights, and we think that it's of utmost importance that we are creating collective vision of 2030 together, because we are sharing these oppressive structures that do not necessarily impact everyone equally. So we're sort of for and against the same thing, although we work in different spheres and have different spheres of influence.
Okay, I see. Wow, it is really a wide coalition, including policymakers and everyone. So both the coalition that you were talking about in Macedonia and the one more, the regional one in the Balkans, what would you say is the objective concretely for the coalitions in the next 1 to 2 or 3 years? What do they hope to achieve beyond, I assume, bringing a lot of different stakeholders together and having a wide discussion?
Yes, so I just missed mentioning that the collective visioning that we're in the process of doing is for the region, first of all, for when it comes to North Macedonia, for the country for 2030, and then the region for 2030, as we're what we heard earlier from JD and about this research as well shows that what we do now, the course that we change now, can be shown. The results of it will be shown in the next decade. But also, we're wide aware that the IPCC, in their special reports, say that unless we shift course now and change it up until 2030, we cannot hope to limit warming to a safe limit. So that's why we're taking the year of 2030 as a milestone, and then working back from it. And the process of creating those visions right now is to then make sure that each and every one of us, both individually and within their group, their institution, their community, makes the most and does as much as they can within their sphere of influence in the next while. Now, for the next couple of years, so until the end of next year, for example, 2021, we have certain political milestones that we need to hit if we want a stronger response. So, for example, in Macedonia, there is a new government that was formed just recently, and having a vision being presented of what people actually need and not what is politically possible is something that can even give them a guideline on how to act and towards what to shape the policy making. We know that we have the climate negotiations were were postponed to next year. So COP26 is happening next year, towards the end of next year, and that's another global milestone, political milestone that we can hit and have a strong collective bold response, if it's only from civil society, but ideally by many stakeholders together there. So we take advantage of these opportunities, both on a national or on a regional or a global level, and push this vision of a better world that we can all live in.
And have you had any responses so far from the governments? You just mentioned Macedonia as a new government coming in, or have you not started yet really engaging with them?
So, as I mentioned, there are a few policymakers who are involved in the process. What is good is that quite a few of them are influential in their positions, and if they wanted, they could really take on board some of the or all. They could take on board this collective vision and put it in more concrete steps within their own institutions. Of course, this will only be done if there's a strong civil society response pushing for that. So these policymakers, that even if they're champions in their work, unless they're backed by strong civil society, then they won't be as bold as they could be in their work. But other than that, we know from our comrades in Bosnia and Herzegovina that they have put forward green and just recovery recommendations for the country there, and there has been little response from the government there, although some enthusiastic policymakers have responded, but not necessarily taken strongly on board the recommendations that were put forward.
I see, but I guess since your coalition is so wide, you already have policymakers in there, so already some kind of route to the government. And then finally, I wanted to ask you, especially during these COVID times where mobility is restricted, and since you have such a wide coalition, what is the process? How are you guys all working together towards this unified vision?
Thank you, Kam, for that question. It's really, we go back to it very often. Right now, the process of the Balkan Green and Just Recovery and the Balkan Green Deal is happening online. So tomorrow is the third session out of a series of sessions that we had to create these documents and visions collectively. However, the plan was obviously to have these meetings in person, because we know that the most radical and inspiring conversations are happening informally between official sessions. Unfortunately, we can't have that, but we do want to encourage everyone who's maybe listening to this to look up the Balkan Regional Forum and the Balkan Coalition, and if they're obviously from the region, to get in touch and to see how we can continue working together. We believe that it's important to make sure that for this process to be as inclusive and as wide as possible, we need change makers and movers and shakers from every community, right? And we're aware that many people, especially the ones that we want, whose voices we want to center in this response, are not necessarily able to get on a Skype or a Zoom call or have access to internet, but That's why the gatekeepers and the change makers from that community should help us provide a wider platform for a unified front.
So we will include links to both the study that JD mentioned and talked about and his article on the Climate Herald in the description box below, as well as links to Simona's work and the initiatives going on in the Balkans region. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us at the latest research news. And JD, Simona, both, thank you very much for joining us today.